see if I can find out how to make this work.
Yes, I also brought a couple of magic tricks. I've got all sorts of stuff for you. You're gonna love this. This is not like any other presentation you've ever seen.
So this is a laser, and this is forward and backward. So you should know oh, that's forward and this is backward.
Okay, great.
And this is live.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So, it's difficult to start a speech as it is difficult to start a business, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring together a lot of what you're about to speak to into some cogent idea to help the audience orient themselves, to set the table, in other words. And I will just start by giving you two thoughts. First and foremost, when I ask people who have successfully founded businesses, who are running businesses and are thinking of exiting their business, one of the first questions I ask them is I say, what was the moment, what was the seminal moment that got you to the point where you decided to start a business? You know, what was the thing in your career? What got you into the channel? Not what, not the idea, but just what got you into that channel. And in my own case, the example that I always say is that the only reason I'm here speaking to you today is because of an appearance that I made at Good Morning America exactly almost 35 years ago. So that's what got me into this channel. So if it were not for Good Morning America, I would not be standing here. But the second reason that I would not be standing here before you is that because what I've learned over the years is that the one thing I have going for me is that I'm open and love to listen to people and love to meet people from all backgrounds and walks of lives. And so I was at a conference about a year or so ago, and I was talking to this fellow, and he said, "Oh, you know what? There's Brenda Lewis. I need to say hello to her. She knows everybody." Now, I didn't know who Brenda Lewis was, but as I was leaving the conference, as I was walking out, who was walking towards me but Brenda Lewis, who I then say hello to, and I said, "I understand you know everybody." And of course, she laughed, and we traded cards, and so we started to exchange conversations, and we were in kind of similar spaces and similar interests and so on and so forth. And then Brenda was kind enough to ask me to speak to her accelerator, which is located down in Stanford. And sitting in the audience was this other fellow who happened to know Doug, who said, "Hey, Doug, you ought to have this fellow, Guy Sullivan, speak to your Inventors Association." And so the only reason I'm standing here is because I stuck my hand out and said to somebody, "Hey, I understand you know everybody." So if that's any way to start something, it at least gets the ball rolling. So organizationally, what I'm about to speak about is the fact that I'm going to take you to a bunch of different places. One of the difficulties of doing that is that when I do that, there's always the problem of bringing people to places where they start thinking about their own experiences, and then their own dialogue goes on, and then all of a sudden I have a room full of Hamlets who are now thinking about everything but that which I'm speaking it to. So bear with me, I'm going to take you to a bunch of different places. The reason I call this speech the Founder's Odyssey, and some of the work that I've done with founders is reflective of my own experience, but I would only tell you that that's only possible because I'm really an accidental entrepreneur. And when I say accidental entrepreneur, it's because when I was an undergrad, I had spent the last 2 years of school in a lab studying the effects of cyclic 3,5-AMP that was injected into the third ventricle of chicken brains, Gallus domesticus. And after those 2 years in the lab, and after getting a degree in chemistry and a minor in neurobiology, I just decided that it was time to take a break from academia. So even though I was fully planning on getting my PhD in chemistry, I decided that it would be good to get a job. And so I went to get a job. Now, in 1983, 35 years ago, which is now leading up to Good Morning America, in 1983, the joke, or the refrain to the joke of what you called a recently minted PhD was, what you called them was waiter, because the job market was so terrible that no one could get jobs. And so the newspapers and magazines were replete with stories of undergraduates who could not get jobs. The job market was terrible. And so Good Morning America happened to be doing a story about how tough the job market was for recent college graduates. And so the placement office at the university said, well, you got to talk to this fellow because he got 3 job offers. And they said, gosh, how did you get 3 job offers? And so I went through the whole process, and there's a whole background to that just in terms of life experiences and the argument of nature versus nurture and what does that really do for us as individuals. But the bottom line is that, and the reason that's important is because what had happened was that wasn't what they were interested in about how I got the 3 job offers. What they were interested in was the 4th company that I couldn't get a job offer from, which was E.F. Hutton. So I told them the story about how I had done all these things, everything from leaving my resume at the hotel where the recruiters were staying. There was a hotel right on the campus, to buying them the Wall Street Journal the next morning with a note saying, here's my resume, I'd love to meet with you today. I had sent them a letter before they came to campus. They sent me a letter saying, thanks, but no thanks. We're looking for econ majors, not chemistry majors. And so I did all this stuff, and finally, it was obvious I was not going to get an interview with them. So I sat in the waiting room hoping that someone would cancel or get sick or forget, and they would have an opening that I could slot into. That came and went. I hoped maybe I'd have lunch with them. That came and went. Did not happen. Towards the end of the day, now I'm sitting there all day long. Of course, I've got my books with me and I'm studying, but I'm sitting in a business suit, which I don't normally do at age 22, which we don't do as college students. But I'm sitting there at the end of the day, and I overhear this conversation about the fact that they're going to catch a bus from the Statler Hotel out to Tompkins County Airport. And so I get an idea. So I go up to the hotel, I buy a ticket on the shuttle bus out to the airport. And so when the recruiters get into the shuttle bus out to the airport, I turn around, and after they've settled down, laughing, and they put their bags in, I turn around and say, "Hi, I'm Guy Sullivan." And I hand them my resume, and they just started laughing. And I said, since we've got a couple of minutes on the way out to the airport, I thought I might as well give you a pitch as to why you should hire me. Now, they loved it so much, they laughed, so on and so forth. I got a letter saying thanks, but no thanks a week later. Well, the reason Good Morning America comes into play is because it's about 2 weeks later, I'm interviewed by Good Morning America. They fly me down, I'm in the studio, they mic me up, so I tell the story about the shuttle bus, so on and so forth. And as I'm telling the story, the recruiter is in the shower shaving, and he hears E.F. Hutton, so he walks out, and there's me, the guy from the bus, telling the story on Good Morning America about how he got all these rejection letters from this guy from E.F. Hutton. 2 days later, I get a call saying, hey, we've reconsidered, we'd love to have you come down. When can you come down? And I said, well, actually, I've got finals, I've got to close my apartment, I'll be down in 3 or 4 weeks. They're like, well, no, we were thinking in 2 days. Can we fly you down and interview? And I was like, well, sure, okay, let's go. So I got down there, and what I was shooting for was this thing called the Principal Training Program, which was this great program that they had. And I went down, interviewed, and got the job. That's the only reason I'm here. And in fact, I started 35 years ago this week at E.F. Hutton in the Principal Training Program. The great thing about that was when I got into the program, it was perfectly suited for somebody like me because I didn't really know anything. I took one econ course. I knew nothing about Wall Street. I knew nothing about investing. I knew nothing about markets. I knew nothing. So I was just an open book. But coming from an academic background, what do? You study everything. You listen. You learn everything you possibly can. So what I was able to do was very quickly, I became an expert. I became an expert in mutual funds, the Investment Company Act of 1940. I became an expert in how you launched a fund, how you manage the portfolios. Everything there was about mutual funds, I knew very quickly. And in large part because, I'm sure you'll remember this from your own academic careers, you had a project, sometimes it would require, you start on Friday, you work all day Saturday, all day Sunday, you turn it on Monday. Well, for me, when everyone else would leave and catch the train back to the suburbs, I would start work at 5 o'clock. Even though I had worked the whole week, I would start work at 5. I'd work until 11 or 12 at night, get up the next morning, work another 15, 16 hours, go to bed, come back on Sunday, work another 15, 16 hours. I get a whole week's worth of work done in a weekend. And when I came in on Monday, I would have something together that would have solved a particular problem, and then bring everybody together and say, okay, hey, I was thinking about this problem, and then share the credit, and then all of a sudden got the momentum to get things done. Okay, so what does that have to do with becoming an entrepreneur? The problem was this. When it comes to money, there's a reason why there are things called the Investment Company Act of 1940, the Securities Exchange Act of 1933, 1934. It's important to have regulations when it comes to money. It's one of the reasons why the United States is one of the greatest financial systems in the world. It has tremendous regulations. And what this has to do with being an entrepreneur is that I thought I was going to be a corporate, I thought, well, I'm either going to be a corporate executive or I'm going back to school. Well, unfortunately, my plans got turned over because Hutton got ensnarled in a scandal where they were basically doing something called check kiting, which is you take a check, you deposit it in one bank, you write a check against that bank, you put it in another bank, and you have this chain. And so by writing those 7 checks, you're earning interest on the same dollar at 7 different banks. They were caught doing it, convicted, 2,000 counts of mail fraud, and as a result, the SEC came and said, we're very unhappy with you, you can't do certain things. At the same time, some of the executives that had departed had gone to a venture capital firm in Hartford and called me and said, hey, we have this idea that we'd like to see a mutual fund company started because we understand the margins are really fat. It's a good business. It's a rapidly growing business. We want to start a fast growing business. We'd like to talk to you. So I fly up to Hartford. They fly me up on a chopper, which really got my attention. And we came to terms. I'm shortening the story, but for consumption's sake. But the fact of the matter is that I went from being an undergrad with a chemistry degree to an expert in mutual funds to someone who was approached to start up a mutual fund company. And because of my time at E.F. Hutton, I was able to rotate through all of the functional areas. So I did everything from sales, service, marketing. I got involved with contracts. One of the best things I did was I convinced the people that I was working for to get me one of the first IBM PCs. I mean, literally the PC, not the XT or the AT or any of the further models, but literally the first IBM PC, which I then talked to a bunch of the guys about how I could have that communicate with the mainframe. I was then able to download all the information about sales, and I became the expert on trends, sales, and who was selling what, when they were selling it. And so at high-level meetings, when they needed some specific piece of information, they would bring me in. So I not only got to sit as a fly on the wall and listen to all the deliberations, but also I was able to bring real expertise to the meetings. I started the mutual fund company, but again, the reason I raise it is because when I've spoken to people who have started businesses, they're really divided into, well, number one, 70% of them started the business because of an idea from work. In other words, they had a job, they got an idea, they saw something happening and said, hey, there's a better way to do this, and they go out and they start a company. So 70% of successful entrepreneurs got their idea and started their company because of an idea that they got from work. So my experience is not dissimilar to that. Second, the biggest cause of failure for most entrepreneurs is because of people. So when you talk to a VC, typically they're going to say that most of the failures in their portfolio have to do with people problems. They can't have them come together, they disagree, they get into, they have divergent ideas, so on and so forth. And part of that is because the founders haven't had the opportunity to have functional experience in all the different areas, and so they have to reach out to fill those holes. And in filling those holes, they have to trade equity or some form of compensation structure in return for that individual to join them. And so it gets very complicated. And so as a result, one of the things that comes up over and over again in the Founder's Odyssey is what I call the 3 R's. And the 3 R's are relationships. Who are the people that are you having join you in starting this this venture? A lot of people hire friends and family. Well, I've seen successes there. I've seen great failures there. And probably part of the problem with family and friends is that the disagreements extend into the barbecue, Somebody has a disagreement, they don't quite know how to say it, so they say it to their wife, who says it to the other wife, and then all of a sudden it becomes this family intrigue versus running a business. I've never involved family and friends. It's always been a professional relationship, and that's where I have found the most success in starting up entrepreneurial activities like that first mutual fund company. So the first R is relationship. The second R are the roles that each individual is assigned. Now again, my first venture was a success because I had rotated through all of the functional areas, so I knew what each person needed to do in order to bring success to the venture. I wasn't guessing, and I wasn't trying to think through, well gosh, I just need a resume that fits this role. I knew what the job required, I knew people who had done that job, I knew how to do it, and then was able to bring in people who could fit that role. The third is reward systems. This is a complicated area, I'm not going to dive into it tonight, but again, the 3 R's are required for success. The reward system that I found to be the best is a mixture of equity and bonus compensation. So coming from Wall Street, you get a low base and you get a high bonus that's incentive to take a lot of risk. That framework has stayed with me. So I believe in that system plus equity in the business, and the equity shouldn't be outright grants, but rather restricted stock that then vests. Now, there are 2 ways to vest restricted stock, either time, in other words, you get certain units based upon how long you stay with the company. The other way to do it is to benchmark it to goals that the company has. Each has its drawbacks. So the best is really a compromise. There should be an element of time, there should be an element of goalposts that are reached. And the reason for that there are multiple of reasons to do that. I won't go into those tonight, but by mixing it, you now have low base, so there's some cash flowing to the employees, to the founders. There's a bonus structure that incentivizes financial structure success for the entity, which is critical. You've got to get cash flow going. And the third is restricted stock, which then rewards founders with equity, but then it vests on 2 different schedules. So the 3 R's are responsibility, relationships, and roles. Reward, roles, and relationships. If you'll notice throughout the talk, I'll use triads of information. Triads of information are very easy to remember, and if you're a musician, you know that triads are the key to anything that you do in music, so you're going to hear a lot of triads. So there are the 3 R's that are key. Then, when you turn to the growth structure of making the entity take off, there are the 3 C's, and I've broken that down into capacity, capability, and conversation. So that triad is the 3 C's of growth. So capacity. Does the founder or founders, do they have the time to step back and find the time to grow? And that's an important question because a lot of times we as individuals, as laymen, we all celebrate the entrepreneur, but that becomes a pretty broad category. When you really boil it down, there are a lot of people that have started businesses, but those businesses are not going to survive the founder. And if they don't survive the founder, then the founders or the founder have not thought about the entity outside of themselves. In other words, what is it that makes this entity work that I've been able to take myself out and yet the entity continues? And I'm talking about a corporate structure like an LLC or a C Corp, but literally, how does the business function without me? What is it about the business that lives on without me? If that question can't be answered, then the founder or founders have not taken the time to figure out how to make the overall entity grow. What's mission critical? What can I do? What am I to do? And what's the best use of resources available? So do I have the capacity to sit down and examine those questions? The second is capability. And capability has to do with the structures. Do you have structurally sound processes in order to make the business go forward? And that includes more of the functions that you typically find that fall under a chief operating officer. So all of those processes that are falling under the chief operating officer, are they structurally sound in order to support the business going forward? So if you don't have the capacity, you don't have the time to step back and think about how to grow the business, what's mission critical, what is going to keep the business going, and what makes the entity separate from myself, you've got a problem. If I don't have the capability, in other words, I don't have structurally sound processes in order to make the business go forward, and that could be manufacturing, that could be, you typically see this in biotech companies. Biotech entrepreneur says, I have found the molecule, I understand the metabolic process, I know how to get the molecule into the cell, and they're very excited. The problem is that where a lot of biotech companies fail is that after the molecule has been discovered, everything's worked out, actually scaling the molecule in production falls short of commercial production, and therefore the biotech venture fails. They haven't been able to take a look at whether or not the production of that molecule is able to scale. And then the third is conversations. And conversations are important because in order to grow a business, you need a little bit of PR, but you also need funding sources, which include VCs, which include banks, which include investors. And so what do you say, and what do you say to whom? So for example, what do you say to friends and family? What do you say to VCs? What do you say to your employees? What do you need to have them believe in the venture in order to bring them with you and through the journey? What do you say to senior staff, buyers, vendors, and other backers? All of those are different conversations that one has to have. And so as a founder, the reason I call this the Founder's Odyssey is because the Odyssey is one of literature's great stories. In fact, the BBC actually ran a survey of the top 100 stories of all time in history, and the Odyssey was the #1 story. And I've always looked to that story because really what it talks about, the ultimate objective of that story is how man must always move forward no matter what the obstacles. And if anyone is interested in being an entrepreneur, I highly recommend dusting off a copy of the Odyssey and rereading it, because it's everything from the greed of your crew members to the gods, conspiring against you, to your complete hubris in front of Polyphemus, who you've convinced nobody has stabbed you in the eye, and then yet you yell out, it's the great Odysseus that's done that, and then that causes Poseidon to get mad at you, and your hubris now knocks you off your course. So I'm taking you to a lot of places, but what I'm going at is that the Founder's Odyssey is beset by those types of challenges. So I started out by saying that my journey started, or my Odyssey started, with this accidental intersection of a E.F. Hutton recruiter shaving and my appearance on Good Morning America, to then becoming functionally literate in something that I'd never known anything about, to then having the opportunity, because of a corporate scandal, causing a break in a career that then opened up an opportunity to have a VC approach me and say, hey, this is what we're looking to do. And then reflecting on those characteristics of what made it a success and what made it a failure. And the most important thing that made it a success, and the most important things that caused failures, was that I personally was on an odyssey. I was making the world safe for mutual funds, but I was also, in all seriousness, bringing professional asset management to individuals who heretofore, it's common knowledge. Everybody here owns mutual funds, they're in 401k plans, they have IRAs. In 1983, no one really knew what an IRA was, no one really knew what a mutual fund was, no one knew what ERISA was, 401k plans had just been invented. And so when I would tell people what I did for a living, people of any age would not know what I was talking about. So here I was at this inflection point, and recently I was at a conference where Tim Armstrong, who's the CEO of Oath, he was formerly the head of North American operations for Google. Tim Armstrong was asked, what's the most important, or what is one of the most important facets of success for any entrepreneur? He said one of the most important facets is to have the wind at your back, right? Because with the wind at your back, mistakes that you make will be covered up by the fact that the wind is at your back. So I thought that was great, and it also brings it back to, again, if you're an expert in the story about Odysseus and the Odyssey, there's of course the story where he gets the favorable winds in a bag. The crew greedily thinks it's riches. They rip open the bag. It lets out the winds. The gods punish them, and Odysseus and his men are pushed back from Ithaca, even though they're within sailing distance, and they're out at sea for another 7 years. So again, the journey needs to be one where you're surrounded by people who are not only competent but ethical, and that's where the whole issue of people come in. And I started my comments talking about venture capitalists recognizing that 70% of the failures have to do with people problems within an organization. And so when founders are looking to take this odyssey, the most important thing, in addition to funding, in addition to having the right idea, in addition to having the wind at your back, is actually the process of hiring the right people around you. And that's why I said before that friends and family are the last place you need to go to, because one of the difficulties is you're going to have an inherently built-in conflict system that cannot be resolved professionally because you've got an overlay of family relations. And so when it comes to hires, there are 5 questions that I push back on to founders to say, before you hire this person, there are 5 things I'd ask you to look at. Number 1 is, how much risk are they willing to take? And that's an important question, because some people say, yeah, I want to do the startup because I want to be an entrepreneur, but they don't know how much risk it's actually going to take. And that will get me to my next triad, but stay with me on these 5 characteristics. How much risk is the hire willing to take? And that's very important. And most people don't know what their risk tolerance is, especially if they've never been with a startup. Because one of the things about a startup is that, and I certainly found this out to be true, is that usually around Friday, 3, 4 o'clock, something would blow up. And the dinner plans and the weekend plans that you had all had to be canceled. And so as a result, personal relationships are put on hold, plans are put on hold, friends are put on hold, everything has to be put on hold in order to resolve the situation before Monday morning comes around. How much risk are you willing to take? Second, personality. There are many, many different personalities. I mean, take a look at your siblings, your family. Look at yourself. We all have unique personalities, and it's very, very difficult to determine what a person's risk tolerance is, what their personality is, whether they're going to be a good fit based upon their resume. So if you need that person in that functional area where you lack that expertise, and you're hiring them just based upon their resume without a sense of their personality, you're going to run into a problem, because that's where a lot of problems pop up. Personalities just don't work. It's not that they don't work when you're having coffee or when you first introduce or you're talking about the idea and everybody's excited. Where personalities come into play is when the stressors come into play. And there's no successful founder, there's no successful startup that doesn't go through stresses. And all you need to do is take a look at some of the greats, Wozniak and Jobs, or Paul Allen and Bill Gates. I mean, 2 people that came together, incredible startup, but as the firm matured, the personalities became increasingly disparate, increasingly clear as to the strengths and weaknesses, but also the dark side of people's personalities emerges as the company moves through its various stages. So personality is very important. Time horizon is very important. That's the third. Time horizon, because it may not take 2 or 3 years to get the product to market. It may take more than 3 years to get the profitability. Now, 3 years is the number that I use, because having done this several times, I always target 3 years positive cash flow. That means another part of the equation. Depending upon the time horizon, that person need have 3 years worth of cash in the bank in order to get them through the period of time where the hockey stick is flat. And then hopefully it goes up. If they don't have that, they're going to be distracted and they're going to be looking for an exit. And then all of a sudden, all that great intellectual capital that they've built up over the past 3 years is lost, because they leave because they can't hold out any longer. So it's important that their time horizon mesh with the founder so that you're both on board for the duration. Fourth, commitment level. Some people try to hold down a job and join a startup at the same time. And then sometimes they can't leave the security of the job and they're giving the startup maybe half the effort that they would have, or a tenth of the effort. That's extremely important for any founder looking to set sail. Fifth and last, value system. And I mentioned before, Wozniak and Jobs and Allen and Gates. Value systems are important to mesh. I mean, they are so important to have that chemistry match. And that's really, I'm not quite sure how you determine a person's value system, especially from a resume. And I don't have advice tonight as to how one goes about determining that. But I think the best way to do it is just to talk and have many, many conversations before making a decision. So those are the 5 capsules that I would say that guide decisions when it comes to hiring, that I try to impart to people who are trying to found a company. So let me go back to something that resonates with founders, and this is something that at Merrill Lynch they've done a lot of work with founders to ask them, really ask for them for their behavioral insights as to what they're doing with their company. And this is an important triad. And if you take anything from tonight's presentation, I would take the following 3 questions. So if you're looking to found an enterprise, or if you're talking to someone who's looking to found an enterprise, or wherever they might be, there are 3 important questions behaviorally that they need answered. The first one, to themselves. The first one is, these are the 3 questions. I started my business to blank. I started my business to what? And it could be anything. And it could include, I started my business so I could spend more time with my family. That's entirely possible. It could be financial gain. It could be security. It could be, I want to change the world. If I invent this, it'll change the world. But I started my business to do blank. Second, I would part with my business if. And that question not only goes to the founder, but then also to everyone else that's on the journey. And I make this point over and over again, that the founder's odyssey is that one person on this journey. The fact of the matter is, and I learned this at an early age, that here I was starting this mutual fund company. Well, there were all these executives that I had to hire. There was a board. There were investors. There were vendors. There were clients. All of them were on the same boat. We were all going theoretically in the same direction, but they were all on their own journeys. And the board wanted to go one way sometimes, the VCs wanted to go another way sometimes, the employees wanted to go another way sometimes, but all these crew members, if you would, that are looking to go in different directions. And so there is a point in time where every founder has to say, I would part with my business if, and if you started the business with co-founders or VCs, I would part with my business, or I would part with the business that I invested with if. And that's an important point, because the VCs that did the original back for this first venture I did, at a certain point, they ran into trouble with the rest of their portfolio, and they said, we're going to sell you. Much to my chagrin and surprise, I said, well, wait a second, we're your crown jewel. How can you sell us? We're generating these returns. And that's exactly the point. You're the only thing we can sell. You're getting sold. And so that was it. There were no ands, ifs, or buts. Third question. After I've answered the question, I started my business to, I would part with my business if, and then third, and then I would blank. And then I would do what? And if the founder could answer those 3 questions comfortably, they not only understand the implications of starting the firm, running the firm, so starting, scaling it up, but then if it survives as an entity after them, or it's an exit plan, or it's bought out, that they understand that there's some finite point in time for the company, or for their role within the company, and what would they do. So, The founder's odyssey needs to be one of design, not default. All too many times people start firms and a lot of what they've done comes about because of default decisions, right? They default into hiring someone, or they default into going into a market, or they default by saying the default decision is I'm going to raise money from friends and family versus going to more professional investors, or I'm going to go bank financing versus. All of those decisions need to be done by design, not default. And that starts with the core founder, their belief systems and what they bring to the table, the co-founders, the early hires, then the investors, and then the board of directors. And if all of those are aligned by design and not by default, the venture will have a lot more chance of success than failure. But that is certainly a difficult thing to do, and that's why so many times when you hear VCs talk about funding ventures, what they're looking at is the management team, because they want to see a track record of people who have gone through the process, have stubbed their toe, have scraped their knee, have fallen down, understand the pitfalls, don't need to be taught about how to get along with others on the playground, and can actually make the thing work. And that's where, if you're looking to start up a firm, that's where the VCs are really looking for. That's where they're looking to. So I will leave you with the last triad for this evening. The 3 keys to starting, and this is, I understand that this is the Inventors Association of Connecticut, but if you're looking to form a company out of an invention, or if you know others that are looking to found a venture, there are really three important things for the individual to also ask themselves. Number one, where am I in my career? An executive who's at a Fortune 500 company who's got handcuffs is less likely to leave because of their career. In my situation, I was an accidental entrepreneur, right? The SEC came in and said, hey, no more mutual funds for you guys. And so I said, well, if this isn't going to work, I've got to go somewhere else. Not that my job was in jeopardy, but it was just not going to be interesting any longer. So I left. I became an accident. It was default. It was not design. Okay, so I violated one of my own principles. But the point is that where are you in your career? And that's why when you look at a lot of people who are making entrepreneurial decisions today, a lot of them tend to be, pardon me, in their 20s and 30s. And when you ask entrepreneurs in their 20s and 30s and into their 40s, and you ask them what their top 4 reasons for being an entrepreneur are, number 1 is power and influence. Number 2 is autonomy. Number 3 is managing people. And number 4 is financial gain. Now, interestingly enough, in sharp contrast, those who are not entrepreneurial, who decide on more traditional roles within complex organizations to become an executive, what they say is that their number 1 driver, their number 1 value in work is security. Number 2 is prestige. Number 3 is financial gain. And number 4 is affiliation. Very different value sets, executives versus entrepreneurs. And that's great insight into the minds of people who are good entrepreneurs. My challenge is that I have jumped from executive corporate to entrepreneur. Then when the mutual funds were sold, I then went and became an executive at a large company. So I jumped back onto the security side because I said, you know what, I'm sick of the insecurity of being an entrepreneur. Then I spent years at a large company being a top-level executive, and I was so sick and tired of jumping on planes and not being in control of my own destiny and the politics and so forth. I said, you know what, it's time to be an entrepreneur again. And then I jumped back, and so I've gone back and forth. So the grass has always been greener for me on either side. And so when I look at how the divide occurs for entrepreneurs versus non-entrepreneurs, unfortunately, that doesn't really apply to me. But I do understand why some people take one track and other people take another track. I understand the idea of the financial security of a big corporation, but I also understand that the driver behind a lot of entrepreneurs is to have the autonomy to do that which they want to do. I mean, so many times you hear entrepreneurs say, you know what, the best thing I ever did, best decision I made, because I don't need to cut through the layers of bureaucracy. I can make the decision and make the move. I've got the autonomy to do that. So, but again, in deciding whether you're going to invest, your own funds with someone who's looking to start up a venture, you might ask them, what are the 4 things that are driving you to become an entrepreneur? And if they say, I want the power, the influence, the autonomy, I want to manage my own people and financial gain, there's your person, there's your entrepreneur. If they say the most important things to me are security and prestige, a big corner office with a staff of underlings, financial gain and affiliation, that's probably not your entrepreneur. That's probably your executive, and you should probably counsel them to stay where they are at XYZ Corporation. So I said there were 3 things. Number 1, career. Should I found now? Where are they within experience and industry knowledge, functional background, and harnessing non-traditional experiences. So let me take you off on a tangent here, okay, before I get into the second and third part of this triad that I'm going to end with. Within careers, and I think this is probably the most important thing about the transformation that we're seeing in the workforce today. So when I graduated from college, the number 1 company that people wanted to work for were IBM, General Motors, big blue chip Fortune 500 companies, right? I mean, that's the way you went. You went to work for a stable Fortune 500 company. Today, it seems as though every university has an entrepreneurial studies faculty, group, department, in large part because the nature of work has changed so radically. And a lot of people are scratching their heads as to why. There are 2 reasons why in my mind. Number 1, the fact that you have computers that are now on everyone's laptop. So when I got my IBM PC, it was a big, heavy box sitting on the desk. Well, my cell phone is a as that computer was a multiple of the computer that put the Apollo mission on the moon, my cell phone is a multiple of that IBM PC. So computers have given tremendous flexibility to the workforce. In fact, I'll go back to, if you were at the last presentation, Steve Schwartz. So he gave a presentation about artificial intelligence. Fascinating presentation, but the one thing that I took from his presentation was that I looked at his presentation, and what occurred to me was, right now we're going through the equivalent of the Cambrian life explosion in computing power. In other words, the whole AI sector, which is, by the way, the hottest sector in VC funding today, that sector is not only hot within VC, but it's hot within pretty much every company you speak to, because they recognize the power, the ability to leverage what they have on their hands, but they can't do it with just the men and women that they have. And by way of analogy, think about it this way. When you go to the gas station, a gallon of gas, I pulled this off. I was talking to a fairly well-known investor. He said so what they did was this investor calculated that 1 gallon of gas, stay with me just for a second, 1 gallon of gas equals 400 man-hours of labor. In other words, by releasing the stored carbon within the Earth's crust, that gallon of gas gives you 400 man labor hours. So 20 gallons gives you 8,000 man labor hours, or 4 years of work. In other words, by filling a gas tank 50 times a year, you have the equivalent of 800 people working for you manually in the field. So in other words, each of us in this room has the power that kings of not too distant past had. In other words, the ability to harness this energy and put it to work. The point I'm trying to make is that if that discovery, the internal combustion engine, did so much over the last 100 years, imagine what AI will do over the coming 100 years. And if not a Cambrian life explosion in terms of analogies, it's certainly something close to it. So going back to what I was saying before, harnessing non-traditional experiences is going to be ever more important for people entering the workforce or starting entrepreneurial functions. So by way of example, so before I became an entrepreneur, I knew a lot about sailing when I was 15 years old. My father had bought me a sailboat, so I put an ad in the paper saying, I give sailing lessons, call me. Well, I learned how to teach people who were a lot older than me how to sail. And one of the problems they always had was stepping into this day sailor with this 15-year-old thinking, okay, wait a second, I'm 2-3 times this kid's age, and he's going to teach me how to sail. And overcome, and I just naturally assumed everyone was just going to get in, so I just never noticed it and just kind of, gave them the value of my expertise. Well, that experience of not being conscious of your age helped when I was now 2 years into a career and now standing in a boardroom before a bunch of VCs, comfortably explaining why they should fund me, start up a mutual fund company, and write the check. I mean, of course you're going to do that. It makes sense. Here are all the reasons. Come on, next. But that early life experience helped. Now, I will tell you another early life experience. I won't go through the whole thing, but I end up through a series of promotions, working the line, which in restaurant terminology means you do one very specific thing over and over again as dinners are prepared. Okay, and I happen to be working by hook or by crook, and it wasn't, this was default, not design. I happened to be working in the kitchen because of a sale. The guy that's running the kitchen is a guy by the name of Jacques Pepin. I didn't know who Jacques Pepin was when I was a kid. I mean, I'm in college. I don't know who Jacques Pepin is. I mean, I know who Julia Child is, but I don't know who Jacques Pepin is. And so I'm doing, I forgot what I was doing. I think I was cracking the tail of the lobster and putting it on the plate, and then I had to swipe it and then put some sauce and move down. I did something wrong. Not speaking French, he's over my shoulder screaming at me, and not speaking French, the only reason I know he's mad at me is because he's not only yelling at me, but there's this vein in the middle of his head throbbing. I'm screwing something up. But then, in order not to piss off my teammates, because of the line, everyone here is depending upon you passing, and everyone down here is depending upon you taking. And so I learned at an early age that I had the ability to kind of multitask, with people really mad at me and continue to do my job. And I only tell that story out of context because it's how do you go from teaching people how to sail to working with this, incredibly hot environment where you're cracking open lobster tails with Jacques Pepin yelling at you. Well, it's just, it just happened to be that way. It was total default, no design there whatsoever. But going forward, taking those life experiences and leveraging them and understanding how to handle people who are very upset because, you've just lost a tremendous amount of money. I mean, the fact of the matter is that by being in a business that was capital markets intensive, the fact of the matter is the market not only crashed in 1987, but what most people don't remember is that the bond market had crashed 6 months beforehand. And the reason I tell that story is because that was actually worse because two things happened. Number one, a lot of people lost money, but two, we had hired the wrong guy. To do our blue sky filings. And a blue sky filing is where you apply to the state and you say, we think we're going to sell X million dollars of securities within your state borders. You have to update it if you sell more. And we happen to be, according to several publications, we were the fastest growing mutual fund complex from a startup in the 1980s. So we had all of this success. We figured out that there was a problem in Pennsylvania where we had registered to sell $2 million worth of securities. We sold $20 million worth of securities. And so now we had to offer rescission because we had hired this guy who had just forgotten, had fallen asleep at the switch, and just then the bond market started to crash. Well, I remember it vividly because I will never forget how much pain I was in. And like a lot of things, you just don't forget those periods of pain. But that is part of being an entrepreneur, is working through that pain and drawing upon those life experiences, like having someone like Jacques Pepin, who I now know who he is, screaming at you at the top of his lungs about some minor detail that you've forgotten. And you realize, you know what? The reason he's Jacques Pepin, the reason he's so well known for doing what he does is because he makes sure that those minor details aren't overlooked. And here was a minor detail that was overlooked, minor detail, that became a major detail. that causes major problems and cost the investors a lot of money. That $18 million rescission is a very, very expensive lesson to learn. And even he's upset about it. So anyway, I'm going to close there and just say, oh, I'm sorry, no, wait, I had the triad. So career, where is the founder in their career? Where are they in their personal life? Very important. So just to bring it home for you, just in terms of that, so you know me as more than just your speaker tonight, from a personal standpoint. So I told you I went back and forth. So it's 2002. We've had all the effects of the tech bubble blowing up. We've had 9/11 occur. The markets are melting down. The company that I'm working for, I'm the president of the 401k division. We are in financial trouble. We need to find a buyer, which is the way of the world in finance. It's that point in time, we sell the company to Prudential, I take the golden parachute, and I go to join another company. And it's around that point in time that my son, it's exactly around that point in time where my son is, we take him to the Yale Child Development Study run by Fred Volkmar. If you don't know him, he's a wonderful light in the world of autism. My son is diagnosed with autism. And so I have to make a decision about whether to get back into corporate life where I really don't control my own destiny, right? I've got to fly where I need to fly. I need to go where I need to go. If the CEO says you need to be here, I'm there. And the question was, do I do that or do I take the golden parachute and start up another company? And I chose the latter. I had done it before. I knew what to do. And again, I had all of the functional roles. I knew exactly what had to be done by who. I knew how to structure everything financially for the employees, for myself, and so that's what I did. Again, it was partly by design, but partly by default. It was a circumstance where I didn't expect to be in that position, where I had to think about my next step in my career. I didn't expect to be in a position where I needed to think about starting a company, but there I was in the parking lot of the Child Development Center, crying over this, terrible news that we had just received, but knowing that in order for my son to progress, I was going to have to devote a lot of time to him. I will end that on a positive note. He graduated a couple of weeks ago with honors from Notre Dame High School, and he's on a full scholarship to attend Sacred Heart University. This is a kid whose IQ was at 82 when he was originally diagnosed. He now has an IQ of 118, but it took a lot of money, a lot of effort, and a lot of focus in order, again, to be an entrepreneur, in order to get him from a startup to a fully developed young man. So I'm very proud of him, and but he is sort of my ultimate entrepreneur story, right? Believing in something, bringing your passion to it, and putting your all into it, and really taking him from where he was basically written off by the public school system to really surrounding him with all the services and things that he needed in order to fully realize his potential. And my goodness, he certainly exceeded everybody's expectations. So it's a positive story. Thank you. So anyway, so where you are in your personal life, and then last, market. Is the wind at your back? Is this an idea where clients are willing to pay for it? And is the clock ticking? In other words, if you don't get out there, invent it, put your name on it, will somebody else take it from you? So that's it, the Founder's Odyssey. It takes passion, it takes optimism, it takes conflict, it takes conflict resolution, negotiating skills, and a bit of hubris, but it's a wonderful odyssey. And it's like the Odyssey itself. It's filled with challenges, it's filled with opportunity, but we all have to get to Ithaca at one point or the other. And my journey started in Ithaca, ended in Ithaca, and here I am today. So thank you for your time and attention.
People ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, something I don't think you included. Sounds to me like you had a very good network of people, like the people who called you from Hartford. Okay, I think being at the right place and time, which to me is networking, seems to be very important, you know, for your success.
Well, and to your point, I mean, I opened the conversation by saying the reason I got here was twofold. Number one, Good Morning America. You know, I had no idea what getting, you know, I knew what getting a job meant, but I just didn't know. I had no career ambition like I want to work for IBM or GM or anybody. I just knew I needed a job because if I'm going to graduate and not go to grad school, I'm going to get a job. The second part of that the opening was that the reason I was standing here was because Doug invited me. The only reason Doug invited me was because
Was a networking.
right, and because I stuck my hand and said, "Hi, Brenda. I was told that you know everybody," and so so that's it's the worst thing that can happen when you stick your hand and say, "Hi, my name's Guy," is the person says, "Leave me alone," or what are they going to do? Most people would just say, "Hi, I'm Joe," or "I'm Mary," or whatever. So, but you're right, and I'm not. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that when I started my career I was a natural networker. I would tell you that I was great in the lab. I could spend a lot of time focused on one thing. I had the passion, so I could really pay attention to it. Interestingly enough, they just came out with a study about educational issues, especially for children that have ADD, ADHD. What they found was that left to their own devices, in other words, taken out of a formal classroom, just allowed to kind of roam through a room with, all sorts of stuff in a room, and they were allowed to find their own passion, that they would be able to focus and concentrate. So it's kind of interesting how the studies are starting to indicate that where you get focus is derived in large part, educationally especially, is where people find their passion. And where you're able to find your passion, that's where your focus is, and that's where your drive comes from. And I would add, just as a commercial, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. So I'm a new board member at the Discovery Museum. I think somebody mentioned that they were a STEM educator. I've got an interest in taking STEM. So STEM at the Discovery Museum, the M is a lowercase m, not a capital M. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out how to make the small m into a capital M and get children who have no interest in math or intimidated by math or don't do well in math, find a way to have an experience at the Discovery Museum that ignites the interest in mathematics.
Where's the Discovery Museum?
It's across the street from Sacred Heart University on Park Avenue, right off the Merritt Parkway. It's actually in Bridgeport, but it's right off the Merritt Parkway, across from Sacred Heart, and they've got a beautiful campus. But anyway, so my point is that I wasn't a natural networker when I started my career, but I think
may not have been, but you developed a network which was very important for your success.
Yes, but that was part of being in the different functional areas. So yes, sir.
First, what you don't exactly point out is you happen to be an excellent speaker. I've heard a lot of speakers. I've been in this group, 8-10 years. Not just here, but I've heard other people speak. Number two, you have a tremendous personality. And with this, you have tremendous heart and values. You're not mentioning any of that. And I think those are the foremost things. Sure, you've learned a lot, you've contributed a lot, you've been through hoops and all. I'm an entrepreneur, I've been doing it for years. And certainly the contacts you made some good ones. You picked some good ones, you got rid of some that weren't so good. And you just have that value that not everyone has.
Well, thank you. But again, I'll go back to and thank you. But I take it as a full compliment. But I'll go back to all of your experiences in life. So in high school, I joined the school play. In high school, I became the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. Part of that process was, and I only mention this again. This is totally out of the realm. But when I was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. When I was editor-in-chief, unfortunately, I came across a story where a young woman, and it became apparent that several other young women had been strip searched for reasons that were vague. I wrote the story. Again, being used to people really getting in your face. At one point, the principal of the school, Lester B. Spicer, is leaning over his desk. There's spittle coming out of his mouth about not allowing me to print the story. So I called the ACLU. I got in contact with a guy by the name of Richard Emery. If you know anything about New York politics, he was running the police oversight board a couple of years ago. Anyway, he said yes to take the case, but then he realized, no, I'm not taking your case. You've already published, because I already published the article. He said, I'm taking the young woman's case. So MMV Shanker, if you remember Irving Shanker, he ran the New York Teachers Union. So MMV Shanker is ruled in her favor. It put an end to strip searches within the New York public school system because of that case. And then, in fact, Safford United v. I forget her name. The young one, Reading. Safford United v. Reading, which was handed down in 2009 from the Supreme Court, again upheld at the Supreme Court level that strip searches within schools were constitutionally were deemed unconstitutional. So it took that long for it to hit the Supreme Court. So to get to your point, you're right. It takes a lot to do those things. And I'll just add parenthetically that the whole reason I reference the Odyssey is because of my father. Because what happened was when I applied to college as a high school senior, or back in our day, you got a letter. And it was either a thin letter or a thick letter. The thick letter meant you got in because it had all the application forms. It was a thin letter, it said thanks but no thanks, kind of like the letters I was getting from EF. Thanks but no thanks. So there are two thin letters, one from Princeton, one from Cornell. I only applied to two schools that's talk about optimism. I applied to these two schools, I get two thin letters, and I was so upset. I opened up the Princeton letter, thanks but no thanks. I opened up the Cornell letter, thanks but no thanks. I was so upset I did what any 17-year-old would do. I headed to the Port Authority. I grabbed some clothes, threw them in a duffel bag, a toothbrush. I grabbed some money. I headed to the Port Authority. But in doing so, I was so angry that it was on the kitchen. My hand knocked over a glass. I cut myself badly. I started bleeding, and I wrote a note, left for Ithaca, Guy. And so my father, upon coming home, my mother's in tears. My father says to my mother, looking at the note, he's holding the note, with the blood on it. He's like, he's taking this Greek thing a little bit too seriously. So that was my journey. So I literally got on a bus, went to Ithaca, and they said, well, your application was incomplete. And so what had happened was the school had retaliated against me by taking my file and putting it in the circular file. And so Princeton and Cornell got, my letter and a couple of other things, but they didn't get any of the letters of recommendation. They didn't get my grades. They didn't get anything. And so I didn't get into either school. So I hopped on a bus to.
So where did you go to school?
Cornell. Cornell. I hopped on a bus at the Port Authority, headed up to Ithaca, and I sat in, it's like the same record being played over again. I sat in the office of Elaine Sesnick, who was the dean at the time of Arts and Sciences. I sat in his office for like 5 hours waiting to get an appointment with him. And finally he saw me and he said, look, here's the story. This is what happened. It's gone to court. It's in litigation. I think this is what happened. This is why you didn't get a completed application. I gave him all the information. He was like, oh, SAT scores, all the stuff you do as a high school kid.
Or your high school deep sixth year.
Yeah, the high school deep sixth.
Son of a bitch! I would have gone back and beat the shit out of the principal.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to do that. Yes, I'm sorry. Wait, there was a question over here earlier.
Yeah, you said something about friends and family. If you're going to hire friends and family, you're going to end up with all those kinds of baggage issues, relationships, and you bring them as partners. They're also very loyal, but on the flip side, you got those other issues. But even if you go outside. In my experience, like sometimes you'll go outside and hire a professional manager, and initially it appears like they have the kind of commitments that you require for a startup. Putting in those long hours and canceling the weekend plans on Friday, and it starts off that way. And then down the line, they slowly regress into, hey, look, I got to leave Friday. Sorry, I got my daughter's birthday party or something like that. And so how do you mitigate with some of those things? Because people will tell you what they want to be when they want to get hired. And then as an entrepreneur, as a startup entrepreneur, you don't have the luxury of a budget to carry people that aren't really pulling their weight. And at the same time, they buried themselves so deep into your venture that you really can't get rid of them easily at the same time without the company taking a hit. It's a tough situation because you have the same problems even with a professional outside hire that you could have with a friends and family type person.
And your comment and question hit the nail on the head, and that's why one of the things I said at the beginning was that VCs say that 70% of the failures are because of people issues, and it includes exactly what you're talking about. It's really difficult. I mean, so many HR departments have set up systems where people take tests and you go through mock interviews. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are done at Fortune 500 level where they're looking at the personality test, and it is in some ways a crapshoot. I would tell you that I would tell you that I can tell you that I've done it imperfectly for 35 years. I really have. I have whiffed some bad ones. I really have. I've hired some great people, but I have really whiffed some pretty bad ones too. So it's in some ways it is a crapshoot, but the only reason I don't, this is a personal opinion, that I don't recommend raising money from friends and family is because they're in your face at the the barbecue on July 4th. Just when you just want to have a beer, and they're in your face about, hey, how's the quarter going? And you're just like, oh. So you don't, so I don't know about that. And there's also the issue of so many people who have raised money from friends and family. They tell the story of how they're driven by the fact that they can't possibly lose Auntie M's money, and that's what drives them. Well, my concern with that is that they're not internally driven by other factors. That shouldn't be the driving factor. And that actually, to me, adds an element of risk-taking that they may be going out too far on the limb in order to get something done so that Auntie M doesn't doesn't lose her money. That makes me nervous as well. I am enamored with professional fundraising for one reason and one reason only. You put yourself in front of a bunch of professional VCs, you may get rejected by 12, but they're going to take you through your paces, and by the 13th, you will have seen all of the holes in your idea versus you pitch your enthusiasm to friends and family like, wow, he's a winner, I'm going with it, here's my money, or here's my career, or here's my time, and then they don't really push back. And that's why I always caution founders not to rely upon that source, but really to look for people who have either had experience with a startup or have the functional experience, but that the personalities meld with yours and that you have a good feeling for the rapport, but that there's someone who you feel comfortable with enough to work with, but who in the interview process asks you challenging questions, right? And if they're willing to challenge you in the interview process versus, oh, I just want to do this, and you need somebody that has that dynamic, right? They're agreeable, but they're willing to challenge. And finding those people is really hard, really difficult.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
and our summer schedule requires that we kind of
Oh,
get out of here by around 8:30. Can we make
Can we
this
take-
the last
yeah.
question?
One last question?
Okay, as you were kind of wrapping up your presentation, I recall the idea of a book I read back in the 60s by Robert Townsend called Up the Organization. And the key sentence in that book was, getting there isn't half the fun, it's all the fun. And I think a lot of times for entrepreneurs, when you're putting in all these hours or whatever, people say, well, why do you do it? You kind of want to blow them off by, talking monetary or whatever, but that really isn't it at all. Or maybe it's a small component, but it's really it's sort of, you are what you do, and you're doing what, something that you have some control over, and you get both the ups and the downs, and ultimately you kind of look at it and say, well, it's destiny what happened, because I can't imagine my life being any different, being married to a different woman or one thing or another. It all seems to be preordained, although along the way, obviously, you made decisions that affected your journey.
And that's the story of the Odyssey, right? It's the gods, and it's, So anyway, thank you everyone for your attention. Have a great night. Appreciate it.
I have a couple of announcements before you guys head out. next month, we're gonna have Evan Kipperman of Wigan and Dana do a presentation on Regulation D crowdfunding. That's gonna be at 7 p.m. in this room on the 31st of July. Also, after the presentation, some people are gonna go to Penny's Diner. Moses, I think you're gonna go. So if you want to know how to get there and maybe grab a bite, go follow Ed and
You go out of the
Moses, and you guys will lead the way.
Main road, you go all the way to the light where you're at.
Just follow Moses and Ed. They'll tell you how to get there. Thank you very much.
No kidding. Okay, good. Give me your card. You know what? Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, this is where the action is right now. Yeah. These are all over themselves.